I think the main theme of week 2 of Mod 2 is like soldiering through it. So, and I say that not because of like a boot camp metaphor or whatever, but because I think that this is one of the hardest weeks of the program. I think it's a hard week in the program because we're simultaneously trying to do a lot of things. We're trying to learn Rails, like, which feels like a big deal because it's one of the main words that we knew before we became students, and so it sits big in our mind as like a thing to conquer. We're also in it, and we're realizing that it's doing a lot of stuff, and we haven't really coded in a way before where the other actor, like our code tool, has so many assumptions and takes so many actions on our behalf that it almost feels like collaborating with another entity. So that's hard. But also, like, we've already gone through one code challenge thing and like dealt with all of the adrenaline that came with that in mod 1. And then furthermore, like, we're looking at a code challenge at the end of the week, so like that sets up a lot of anticipation and anxiety. And then on top of that, we also have the situation where like it just gets tiring, right, to keep on coding week after week after week. So a big piece of the lectures this week, you're going to see us revisiting concepts a little bit as we go to kind of like almost like play like a game of leapfrog where like we go step back and then 2 steps forward kind of deal, in order to make sure that we're covering everything multiple times, to let things sink in at a good pace, but also be mindful of taking breaks and being gentle with yourself throughout today and tomorrow and Thursday as you do your work, because this is historically the time that most students see like the biggest slump in their morale over the course of a given week. So right now, what I'm going to do is clear my desk a little bit, and then we will get into this code. It's the same code from yesterday. I'm mainly just attempting to continue with some of those thoughts and go into a different form. So we had our cohorts controller. We had our like cohort.new getting created at the new. And when we talked about a form yesterday, that meant that we had to go to a view, right? So I always start in my controller still, whether it's Sinatra or Rails. And as I'm reviewing now, I'm going to review through the cohort creation process, talk through what we did yesterday for about 5 minutes, and then we'll lay out our goals for the day and then accomplish those goals in Rails, doing some more form work. So to start out, in our cohorts controller, we have our new method. That is going to correspond to a given route. I'm going to double click these so that they stay open in my tabs. Config routes. Because we have all of resources cohorts at our disposal, that gives us the 7 restful routes by default. So we can say Rails routes, and that's going to draw them out for us. That includes a cohort's new URL corresponding with a get HTTP method, and that's going to run our cohort's new method. By the way, if we needed to create a URL, cohort/new, we could also call new cohort path or new cohort URL, because that's the method that the prefix gives us access to in Rails. In any case, we're here. I don't need to worry about this cats thing. I was just playing around with some stuff yesterday in one-on-ones. So cohort's new. We have a new cohort that gets created. It's .new, so it's a nil. Like there's nothing to it. There's no data in it. And then we're going to make sure that that renders in cohorts new, because the view of the same folder name and file name as the class and method is what's going to get called automatically. And now we're in a form for at cohort. That's our brand new cohort. Do F. As we open the block with F, we are building this form. We're building this form in the context of this cohort object. Rails under the hood calls cohort.class, sees this is an instance of cohort, and so it's going to basically call like cohort.name on that cohort instance to see how it's going to fill this text field. Label and text field both have the same value for their first argument, so they'll be connected to each other in the raw HTML that comes out with those ID tags that generate and the for tag in the label. And then the f.submit, it's going to say create cohort, because it knows that this form is about creating a cohort, because I gave it a cohort instance. It knows what the class is, so it can draw the string on the submit button as the value. And then it also knows that we're creating, because the cohort doesn't have an ID. That's why this form, when it generates the first line, the opening form tag, is going to have /cohorts with the post as the method. That's because it sees a cohort with no ID and assumes that we're going to create one. And because Rails is privy to the routes that it draws up, it knows exactly how to deal with cohort creation. So there's a lot of seeming magic in how this form gets actually built in Rails, but there's no real magic going on. It's really just very stringent conventions that are being followed very specifically. So let me shut down my server from yesterday. Let me open up another one. And I always put my server on the left. That's just a thing I do. Rails S. Cool. Let's go back to this new and just review how this object creation looks. Oh shoot, where's my Chrome? My bad. I'm in it, but I don't have the window open. Did I have it full screen? Nope, I did not. Let's just get a new one. Cool. Localhost 3000 /cohorts/new. So that form generator put on the page for us a form that we can inspect. A big debugging piece of advice that I share with every Mod 2 cohort that I teach is to always be looking at the HTML under the hood, not just what you see in the browser, but try to connect how these things come together. So we have this form. Sure enough, it wants to do a post to /cohorts because it made the right assumption about the object that I gave it. It's added the authenticity token for a little bit of security. We've created the label between the opening and closing tags that basically just titleizes the value that I gave it for label. So lowercase name becomes uppercase name. Text field lowercase name becomes something different. Text field lowercase name becomes cohort name. And why? Well, because we're not just building a text field lowercase name. We're building an f.text field lowercase name. Check this out. If I just say text field name, the whole form changes, right? I get this argument error, wrong number of arguments given 1, expected 2, 3. F is providing an argument under the hood this whole time. When I call the method on the target of the form, the method actually runs differently. It takes different arguments. It doesn't need to know how to start naming a field. It knows it's going to start with cohort bracket because that's what the form is for, right? If I don't attach this to the f dot, it doesn't know what the text field is for. It doesn't know that this is a text field for a form for a cohort. So I'd actually need to fill that in. I'd have to say cohort as the first argument, and then I'd have to pass another string of how we're going to nest inside of it. That gives us cohort name again, right? So the F happens in this form builder block because the whole time we'd really like to call F dot inside of there so that we can, so we can carry the knowledge of a cohort throughout this form as we build each individual field. It's kind of a cool thing that Rails knows how to do. And it's why we process this stuff through a block. It's why we specifically have a block as we build the form so that we can carry that context. In any case, we fill out this form. We put a name in here. That means that when we said cohort bracket name in the name of the input, that means that if params is a hash, it's going to have a key in that hash called cohort now. And the value of that cohort key will be a nested hash. Inside of that nested hash, there's going to be a key called name, and the value is going to be whatever I type here. I'll say whatever. If I can type it, I'll click on create cohort. That adds whatever to the cohort, right? How'd that happen? Well, something happened in a post route, and then we got redirected. We got redirected to the index after a cohort saved. The cohort saved because we gave it a set of cohort params. This is just a return value of a method, right? When we call params.require.permit, what comes out of that is a hash-like object of the same class as params, which is this active controller params hash thing. Dot require cohort says, give me the key cohort, give me the nested hash at that key that we fired in when we said cohort bracket name in the HTML. And then it says, go ahead and permit the following keys in that nested hash. So I want to see their keys and values, basically. I want to see the key and value for name come out in this hash. If there was a second thing for cohort that I wanted to see, like, I don't know, updated at, that's something in the database that we could conceivably set. I would just comma separate these things. And in the labs, you have plenty of opportunities to practice with these strong params. Please do ask questions about this piece of it if you're not sure how this is working. I think this is crucial to everything you do. And of all the things to dig deep into, this is probably one worth doing. Yeah, Alice, what's up?
Sorry, can I just ask with my volume?
Of course.
How does cohort params function? Like, have access to like params variable there?
Oh, because at the moment that we call on cohort params, we're inside of this create action. So if the create method context knows about how to get to params, then the cohort params method that gets called is also going to know how to get to params, logically speaking. Yeah, and Jack is asking, is this method designed to work as a filter for params? That's exactly it. I'm filtering a specific subhash of params, and within that, I'm filtering specific keys within that subhash. So yeah, in general, if I'm in this controller, since it's inheriting from application controller, and since application controller inherits from action controller base, any action controller base descendant will have access to that params within the context of any controller action? Very good question. That's where it comes from. It's provided to us from Rails just like Sinatra provided it to us. For sure. So that's our create, right? We take that cohort params, we pare it down so it essentially is just name whatever, and then we pass name whatever into cohort new. That name whatever will work because we've called dot permit. If we didn't have the dot permit, active record would throw like an unpermitted params error at us. Since our cohort model, we have to go back and look at the model. I know it's been a while, but let's check it out. Will the cohort save? Well, it has many students. I added this dependent delete all, by the way, because if I delete a cohort, I want any students that belong to it to also get deleted. But in any case, there's nothing here that tells me that a cohort cannot save without a name, right? I've created like a virtual attribute here, like an alias for the word name, just to demonstrate how that might work. But in terms of the behaviors on cohort, nothing is prohibiting a cohort from saving as long as it has like just a cohort object to save. There's no validations whatsoever. So we know this cohort's going to save, and it did, and we redirected back to cohorts. That, I know it took a little bit longer than 5 minutes, but that's essentially where we're at right now in terms of our application. I want to turn our focus to students today and dig into that. I know we had some labs that also dealt with this concept yesterday, and so I think that this model domain is nice and comfy for us. Let me find my DB folder. It's such a short folder name, and it's so far down the list of a Rails app, I often lose it. But our cohorts have names, so do our students. Our students also have cohort IDs because let's all think about the nature of the relationship between cohorts and students for approximately 5 seconds. What kind of relationship? How do they associate with each other? If you thought to yourself, well, of course, a student is going to belong to a cohort, and a cohort has many students because the belonging thing always has the foreign key back to the many having thing, then I would think it's a one-to-many relationship here. Because I don't see that there's a third join table. If it was a many-to-many, we would have like something in between cohorts and students, like cohort students or cohort signups. In real life, a student might be in many cohorts over time, but according to just this schema, since the student has the foreign key directly back to the cohort, that's the tell to me that a student belongs to one cohort, and therefore a cohort can still have many students, but because of the other side of it, it's a one-to-many relationship. Knowing that it's a one-to-many relationship, right? That tells me certain things about how students and cohorts might associate with each other. So a cohort does have many students. Don't worry about this dependent delete stuff. We'll get to it when we talk about deletion later on. But a cohort has many students, regardless of any options I add to that. And a student belongs to cohort. And I want to pause real quick and hop into the rate console, or Rails console rather, and just do a quick review on how these things associate together. Oops, not Rails. What did I just say? Rails, of course. And then it's going to help me out and tell me things I can do. And I want to do this specific thing. There we go. So we'll get in the console. And I want to pull up a cohort. Let's see, cohort equals cohort.third. And what did it do here? It limited to one cohort from all of the cohorts that there were. And then it offset by 2. That's how we got to the third one. Not the first, but the second, third. And then cohort ID was 6. The name is the YOLO cohort. Created this yesterday afternoon. Fantastic. So we've got this cohort. We could call cohort.name, right? That gives me YOLO. That I could call cohort.createdAt. I did create that virtual attribute, by the way. I can show how that works for anybody who was curious of why I had that here. I was just exploring what Rails forms could and couldn't do. Like in a Rails form, I couldn't say that the name of a field was cohort name without having a method called cohort name. So I was experimenting with, what if I wanted to have a method without adding a migration? Like, what if I wanted my migration field to just still be name, but I wanted to have an alias called cohort name, and the reader would just give me that name, and the writer would take in a new value and just set the name. So this would be a way for me to have like an interface layer, and then if I wanted to have something like, canonically, all of my cohort names are always printed out downcased. And to make sure that that keeps on happening, maybe I'm going to take every new name that comes in and also downcase that. This gives me like a different way to do name stuff. But in any case, I've got that method. I should be able to call it here. Cohort name. Cool. This one's still capitalized because we're in an open console session. I just made these edits after opening the console. That's why we're not seeing downcasing right now. But cohort.cohort name works. That's kind of cool. We've got this stuff. What about the association? Cohort has many students, so we should be able to call .students, right? And this gives me a collection proxy back. The collection proxy is empty. So I want to play around with this has many association a little bit, because I think that at this point, we're all okay with setting up associations and iterating through collections, but when it comes time to setting objects, I think that some people might be doing things more by hand than they absolutely need to be. So I'm going to look up has many. And we'll, oops, sorry. There's our has many. It specifies the one-to-many association. And so we have this collection shovel, and it'll take an object. It'll also, fire update on this. So like it fires update SQL, meaning this will save to the database. So we'll run SQL by doing this method. I want to try this. I want to get a student. I want to say cohort.students shovel student.first. So look what just happened here. We first selected our first student, right? Because we called student.first to figure out what to shovel. And then what did we update to shovel into cohort students? It looks like we updated cohort ID on the students table where the student ID was the one that we had just found. So I think that what just happened was in order to add a student to cohort.students, we really just had to change the foreign key on that particular student, which is kind of weird when we think about, like, we started with cohort dot, so it almost feels like we'd be making a change to the cohort because we're making a change to the cohort students. But the nature of that change in the database itself is that the student will just refer back to a different cohort. It's really important to be thinking in the back of your mind about what database fields will need to be either created or changed in order for an association to come true, because when you watch Active Record do stuff, you want that to kind of map out close-ish, at least, to your expectation of how the database is going to change. If you don't set that expectation, you don't know if your expectation is wrong. If you do set the expectation and your expectation is way off, at that point you can be like, hey Duke, let's talk about this database stuff a little more because I want to make sure my associations are on point. But it's really hard to confront ignorance that you haven't had a chance to expose yet. So set expectations on what your database is doing so you can see what happens on the other side of it. Cool. So cohort does connect to students that way. We could also make a new student for a cohort. We could say cohort.students. Here's a method that we can do. Collection.build. We'll make a new object of the collection type, which has the link to this object through a foreign key. So if a student links to a cohort with cohort ID, then if I say cohort.students.build, I'm going to pass in a hash for a new student. Name Fran Danielson. Now we've got a new student, which has no ID because we haven't saved it because build doesn't save yet. But we've created a name for the student, and we know what the cohort ID is because that's our cohort ID right now. So this is a pretty powerful tool, this students association, right? Like we could call _.save, get that student in the database, fantastic. We could also do something like this, cohort.student_IDs. Student singular here because the plural goes on the IDs, and that's actually association singular IDs right here, or collection singular IDs, returns an array of the associated objects IDs. So we only have IDs 1 and 7, right? If I wanted to say cohort.studentIDs equals 1 and, I don't know, what are the students' IDs? Let me find that out first. Student.IDs 2317. Okay, I'm going to change the 1 to a 2. I'm going to say cohort.studentIDs equals 27. And that means that it's going to have to remove a 1, add a 2, and keep the 7 all in place, all at once. And it's going to have to only do that for certain students and their cohort IDs. Check the work. This is so cool. It goes and finds the students with 2 and 7 and makes sure that they both refer to me, right? And then look what just happened. It deleted from students where students' cohort ID and students, so the cohort ID was 6 and where the student's ID was 1. So do we have a student with ID 1 anymore? Student.IDs. We no longer have a student ID. So this was a pretty destructive change. because since the cohort student IDs was changed to kick off a student, and because we have a dependent delete, this is where that cohort dependent delete thing came in. If we ever deleted a cohort, all of the students that belonged to that cohort would be deleted, and we see a smaller version of that happening here. That by taking a student out of the cohort belonging, that student now has a nil cohort ID, but a student must belong to a cohort. This is running a version of Rails that is making that a hard expectation. So the moment that I take a cohort ID off of a student and I save it, I lose that student. Like, it goes away. So I probably wouldn't want to like do ID resetting with an array like this if I had that kind of connection set up, if I wasn't sure about keeping track of all of those students and maybe moving them to other cohorts first. But this is really just a review to play around with some of the things that we can do with associations, right? I don't just have to call cohort.students all the time. I can call cohort.students.build. I can call cohort.studentIDs. I can do the equals with that. I can do a cohort.studentShovel. If you haven't used any of these, I recommend you use all of the ones that I'm showing you that you haven't used yet, just to get more familiar with them. It's going to help you a lot in the controllers, I promise. If you're in the controller and you don't feel like you know what to do with your models when it's time to connect them together, that's a really anticlimactic feeling. It takes a long time to get your params in the shape that you want them from the form. Make sure that you can do stuff like this so that you can bring it home. Let's demonstrate. I want to create a student that belongs to a specific cohort. In Sinatra, how did we do this? We created a select, right? Like literally, we had like a select form, and then it had options, right? For every cohort, we had to we would have had to include all of the other objects. We had to call object.all to render to some sort of select. Let me try to sketch this out. Let's see. Let's go to our controllers, students controller. Let's build an action for a new. I think that we're going to need to get a new student. So at student will equal student.new. And what I'm envisioning is another kind of drop down like we did last week. And last week when we did the drop down, we had to fill it with each of the things that it could potentially belong to. So a student belongs to a cohort. I'm going to say cohorts equals cohort.all. I think that's the information I'm going to need in this view. I need to create a students view. So I'm going to do that. New folder, students. Within this, we'll make a new .erb. New file. While I'm here, I'm going to actually make an index.erb too. I'll probably rename them to include the HTML just so I can stick with convention. If you break the convention on like why a file is named a certain way, it creates a lot of dissonance for other programmers. They don't know how much time they should spend thinking about why that one thing is different, and they'll usually end up spending too much time. So it's good for you to make sure that your stuff is super consistent. Cool. So we're in this new for a student, right? And we could have like an H1, like welcoming somebody, create a student, create a student. Sure. And then we can have a form. I'm going to go to using the Rails. You know what? Let's start with the form tag. We might have time to do both of them. I'm going to say we'll render this form tag. Because, yeah, I do agree. I don't want to show, like, the old HTML again. Because, like, I think we can envision, like, what we kind of did in Sinatra or pull that code up again. We can always look at a select tag, and we can look at the select tag containing, like, iterating through option tags. So I want to kind of go to the form tag version of it so we can get right into Rails. So form tag is going to take a URL, right, as the argument, and it's going to default to a post method. We want to create a student here. So I'm going to say /students, and then I'll say do. And then we can go through here and end our tag. And here I'd like us to have like maybe a label tag. That is our student name. And I think this should actually be student name because I'm using a form tag. When I'm using a form tag, I don't have the benefit of like carrying an F context that knows that this is a student instance. I just have a string here. So I have to be more specific because I can't lean on the fact that there's like a Rails object there. So that's going to be one label. We'll do an input tag as well. So that'll be a text field tag. Then the student name here is going to be, oh, sorry, when you said Jack, I'm seeing now the .html does feel sort of redundant. It's because in some cases it wouldn't be able to evaluate the file as an ERB, but it could still default to being read as HTML. It is redundant in most cases because we wouldn't expect to have a problem reading the ERB. It's just an additional stopgap that people put in case some interpreter, for whatever reason, has trouble running the ERB. You could still like default to just kicking back template HTML for the time being. Not necessarily even what you'd want to have for every case, but you see people doing it from time to time, and I wanted to get you used to seeing that syntax too. That's why the file name is named that way. Yeah. Text field tag, student bracket name. So these two should match up just fine. This should nest name inside of param student for me. And so here I'd like to do this again with a label. I'd like this to be like student cohort maybe, or I'm actually, well, let's fight about this for a second. Somebody pop a comment in. Should I say that my next thing is going to be student cohort because a student belongs to a cohort? Or should it be student cohort ID? Or should it be something else? What say you? Cohort ID. Got 2 votes for cohort ID. If I'm looking at the schema, I think that the schema is calling for a cohort ID. Yeah, it kind of looks like this is like, if I'm trying to set name on student and I'm expecting that's going to work, I'm probably expecting it's going to work because the schema is going to hold that value called name, right? And so if I'm expecting to make a save to a database, right, I know in my heart that the student will belong to cohort, but I have to stop thinking in Rails object terms. I have to think of this form as a way to get information ready for a database. So yeah, could I do cohort student cohort ID? I suppose I could, yeah, if I was making a nested form where I was creating a cohort and students, I'd probably even have another layer in between. I'd probably have something like cohort bracket student attributes bracket 1. Sorry, I can do this correctly. Cohort student attributes, close the bracket, open and close bracket 1, and then cohort ID. Potential or name maybe. I guess at that point, if I was nesting like this, I probably already carry the ID of my cohort at this level. So if I was going to have nesting of this sort here, I would probably not really need it because by the time I know what my cohort is, I could probably call like cohort.shovel or cohort.students.shovel in the controller when I get to that part. But yeah, if it was like cohort student cohort name, and careful, I wouldn't nest them fully in each other. That's always going to be like sequential nesting. So I open and close a bracket, then I open and close the next, and then I open and close the next after that. But what I'd be saying here is that if I'm building a cohort with a nested form that accepts nested attributes for a cohort students, I could build cohort.student.new 3 times, and then the form would have potentially like 3 sets of student attributes. And so this would be a way that I would send the name of the first student that I was filling in. There are Rails nested forms labs that look extremely dicey and weird for a lot of people at first glance. I think that those are actually some of the best labs at really developing your own understanding of how nested form data pertains to the way that we name form fields, and also how Rails prefers us to deal with nested form data in the controller, which is a pretty important concept. Frankly, I don't think that it is, it's not a deeply enough covered concept early enough that I would expect to see a whole lot of that stuff on a code challenge. But in terms of like general Rails, the nested form labs are really quite good, particularly for people who are looking to hit their stretch zone. I have not done any more in the form. I've stayed like right in the schema this whole time. Sorry, if you're only showing the schema, I just typed something like this in response to the chat. I'm not sure if people could see what I was doing in the chat. I'm realizing now that Zoom might only be showing me a chat window and y'all can't see what I'm over here with. But yeah, Jack had asked cohort student cohort ID, and this is what I had drawn out: cohort bracket student attributes bracket 1 bracket name, and that's for a later on lab when we talk about nested forms, and I'll probably cover that. If not tomorrow afternoon, potentially like Thursday at some point, to make sure that everybody has some more specific exposure with this nested form stuff. But I'm going to bring it back into the student new form for now, because I've gone into the schema. I've determined that the student needs to set a cohort ID, and that's the name that I want for this field. So at this point, this is where we would have like a select tag, right? We'd have like a select, and then we'd have like some sort of like iteration happening. We'd say like at cohorts dot each do cohort, right? We'd have some sort of loop. And then before the loop closed, we'd have to like create some option tags. So we'd have like a option, and then we'd close the option tag. Or no, is the option? I think it just has values, right? It would have like the name would be, or no, the name is on the select itself, right? Because each of the options provides a value. So the name up here would have to be student cohort ID, and close the bracket. And when we have this select, within this, I should indent to make it clear what I'm doing. That reminds me that I need to close my select, which was helpful. Then our option is going to happen, and then this is going to have like some sort of a value, right? Value equals, and then this would be the cohort ID. Right? Something like that. We'd probably interpolate that using some Ruby. Something like that. And then we'd display the cohort name before the closing option tag, right? Do another interpolation here. And I believe that this is how we'd generally be able to draw some sort of select. I'm not even sure if this is valid HTML the way that it's written, but I think we've got enough on the screen that we could certainly take a look and try. Let's go to create new students. So let's try /students /new. I'm confident I'm going to be able to get there because earlier when we were glancing through our routes, we saw in config routes that we had resources students. And so students new is like a completely conventional named route, right? So I believe that we have no trouble getting here. And sure enough, oh, now interesting, yeah, because we're in a text field tag world, we're doing the tag, so the name that I chose is also the name that's being displayed. If I want to display a different name, I can add an argument, and that would be the display value. So, oops, not here. I'm going to get out of the cohorts form so I don't make that mistake again. First time you make that mistake, you should probably get away from that file somehow. Student name, so I'm going to say here, name. I'm going to also say here, cohort ID, or cohort. Because that's really what I want to show the student, or the user. And so now this has definitely changed by adding that second argument. I haven't changed like the name value of the input, so I can go in here and inspect and see that we have this input with the name of, sorry, my chat is obscuring it, student bracket name as I'd like to see, but then I don't also have to show student bracket name. That's why it lets me pass in multiple arguments so I can control what the person sees as well as what I do under the hood. So here we have cohorts, right? And I'm displaying names. And then if we look at the values for each of these options, I bet we're going to have cohort IDs there. Yeah, value 1, value 3, value 6, value 7, value 8, value 9. I want to actually do this. Let's do Frederico Tull belonging to this cohort. Oh, no, we don't have a submit button, of course. So let's do a submit tag. Let's say create student. Refresh. Frederico, create student. Oh no, and now where am I? Let's go and look. Started post students. This is what I was hoping would happen. When you go to a post route in Rails, your controller output is going to show you the parameters. And so we can see here that we do have param student. And check it out. The name of the student will be Frederico Tull, and the cohort ID will be 1. So we did pass by the values that we wanted to. The student was able to get their stuff nested into param student, and then also their cohort ID was selected by the dropdown. So how do we refactor this? How do we make this a little bit better? We have not just raw HTML here, right? But we have this ability to do what's called a collection select. So let me comment this out. And let's refactor to a collection select. Rails collection select. Oh, and you know what? I want it to be a tag version because we're doing form tag. You always want to add tag if you want to get your like right element. So collection select is actually the one that I'd want to use for a form 4. I'm not in a form 4 right now, so I'm in a form tag. So I'd want to use select tag for this. So when I hop in here, this will create a drop-down selection or a multiple choice selection if you say multiple true. We don't need to set multiple to true here because a student just belongs to one cohort. So what's kind of cool here is that you call select tag and then you name what's happening here. Notice that this ends up naming the select. So whatever your value is still going to be the name. So I think we'll still want to say like student bracket cohort ID. And then you pass in as another argument, another method call, which generates your option tags. So options from collection for select is going to fill all the guts of the tag. Up here, we decided what the name is going to be, kind of like what we did right here, where the select was name of this, and then we got inside and iterated through a collection and decided to send the ID as the value and render the name. So here we have the collection that we're iterating through, the value that we're sending, and the value that we're rendering. And when we say value here, Rails is going to calculate this by calling ID on each object in people for each option. And then for each option that's being built, when it has to display something for that option, it's going to call .name on each instance inside of people. So right here is the code that we can use. And let's try it out. Let's interpolate. We're going to render this. Oh dear, that was way too much. I did not copy that correctly at all. I think I copied the whole box. That's on me because the word examples up top. I didn't catch that. Much better. Okay, so I'm going to make this screen a little bigger so it's easier to see because this is a longer line of code than anything else we've dealt with so far. Our select tag here is not going to be called people, right? It's going to be called student cohort ID. I'm going to keep it to the single quote strings for now just because I've been doing that. Student cohort ID, and then we'll do options from collection for select. What's the collection? It's cohorts, right? That's the thing that we set in the controller a second ago by saying cohort.all. And we're going to call ID on each individual cohort to set the value attribute for the option. And then we're going to display cohort.name. Each of these could be symbols, by the way. They don't have to be strings. Rails doesn't really care too much. Let's see what this looks like. Okay, that looks exactly the same. Like exactly the same, right? Let's check our HTML. This is what we commented out. Notice because even though we commented it, right, it still has to run the Rails inside to figure out what it comments. So if you ever make a mistake inside of embedded Ruby, HTML commenting it is not going to be enough. You'll actually want to like add a Ruby comment in there to keep that from happening. In any case, that's what it looks like there. And then if we look at this select, it's student cohort ID, values, display names. Y'all, it's like exactly the same. The only difference is that Rails gave it an ID for me that I didn't have to type in by hand. So it's already better, right? I did a lot less typing and got a lot more for it. But this does require me to think of my select in terms of the collection that I'm iterating over in a very structured way. I have to think that every single object is going to send its value and display its name. So this is some syntax that could potentially work. I want to try to create Federico again under the same conditions, and I want to check the output in the controller to make sure that the params hash looks the same too. And we have name Federico Tall, cohort ID 1. Fantastic. This is looking really good to me. I think that we're ready to get into the controller and not just have it hang up here, but do post students. Where is post students going to need to go? We can always check on Rails routes for that. Probably one of the harder things that took me a while to understand in my like mod 2 and my experience was that the second that a form happens or the second that a link gets clicked, I need to think about a controller that's doing something. So here we have, we're going to create a students. Okay, post students is where we're going to go, and that should be the action students create. So let's flesh that out. Students create. Here we'll have some params, right? So we could do p params. I know we're going to see them anyhow, but it's a comfort object for me. Let me try some other stuff too. Let me try like p params dot require student, because I think we're going to have that level of nesting up top. And then I think if we did right below that, p params dot require student, dot permit. And then we'll permit, well, we won't permit anything. And then finally, just to review how we did this yesterday, params.require student dot permit, and we're going to permit the attributes that we want for the student. And I think this final syntax will give us what we need, but I want to kind of compare it to the intermediary steps once again. And then I think we could think about where we're going to go after creation so we don't just hang up here. I think right now I want to redirect back to student new, because I don't think we're really ready to move on until we get the student created. So I'm going to say redirect to, and check it out, new student, because we're making a new student singular. So that's the prefix here. I'm going to say new student path to be real railsy about it. Cool. I'm going to go back to students new. I'm going to hit enter here. We'll create Sam Jeffries in the third cohort. And we'll click on create student. That did go back around and reload. And now we can look at the back end and see what printed out. And we've got a few params objects here. This is the first one that's just the params, right? It's action controller params. It has permitted set to false, right? At the very end here, because we haven't done any sort of permitting. And then here, this is when I said params.require student. And now we're just getting the student attributes, still not permitted. Unpermitted parameters are name and cohort ID. Then we do params require student permit, but we don't give it any arguments. So now it's useless, right? We have no student params permitted. At least we did get it allowed, but then finally we put it all together. We require the student, we permit specifically name and cohort ID, which populates the hash with those keys and their values, and also permits our action controller parameters object. So all of that code could probably be our strong params method. If we said p student params and moved this code down into a private method, params require student, permit, name, cohort ID. So then I believe that we'd be able to do this. As a matter of fact, I'm so confident, because that really does look like exactly the hash that we want, that I want to kind of make a leap of faith and call student.create student params. And instead of doing that, I'm going to redirect to student's path. Now I'm expecting a success and a problem. Let's check it out. Refresh. Name, Jalen DeBoniak. Hope. Cool. Now we're at students. We're displaying nothing. Why? Because I didn't create an index view. But what did we have happen? I'm looking for a commit, y'all, and I see the commit right there. That means that we successfully saved our student to the database. I'm ecstatic. We saved it with the right name. We saved it with the right cohort. I think what we should do is like have a student's index that displays, and then maybe work with some of the read elements of this association real quick. Let's check it out. So we're here at /students. Nothing's happening. That's our index action. So here I could say at students equals student.all. We could make a view, nothing too fancy. We've got it right here. So let's look at students. Students.each do student. That's a typo on my part. We'll end this before we even begin it, because that's something I always forget otherwise. And then for each of these students, let's like pop a link to that student. Link to student name. Let's travel to the student path. Let's see what that looks like. I forgot something. No route matches, action show, controller students missing, required keys ID. Oh, it's because it's trying to draw the student path for the show, and I didn't give it the key ID, because the student path here is this, singular student, student/:ID. I didn't give it anything to fill :ID, so I have an error. But if I pass in the student itself, that should work, because now I've provided each student with what it needs. So cool, we have our 4 students that we created. We can click on one. We don't have a show like thing happening. We don't have a template for that student to show, but I think we could put that together really quickly. Let's do that. Let's make in our show, students, new file, show.html.erb. Pardon me. In the controller, in the show, let's go and find a student. We know that we have params ID because we just had that problem. So we'll say student equals student.find from params ID. That should give us a student that we have access to on this show page. And then what I'd like to do here is, let's see, student show, maybe an H1 that has the student name. And then we close that tag, and then we talk about maybe the student belonging to a cohort, maybe a P tag here. I belong to the something cohort. Let's do, let's use the association, right? We could say at student dot cohort, right? Because a student belongs to a cohort. We saw that from our model earlier, even though I think I closed that file. It's over here somewhere. But yes, since student belongs to cohort, when I call cohort, it's going to go and look for the cohort where the ID is my student's cohort ID and return that object. So here I should be able to say I belong to the student.cohort.name because that should give me the whole object back that I can call for the cohort name on. And I could even put this like in strings to make it look like the student's really talking to me. Cool, let's try this out. Click Fran Danielson. Yeah, Fran Danielson, I belong to the YOLO cohort. We should probably have a nice link back to students now that I'm on the page and realizing I'd have to hit the back button. Say link to, back, student's path. Cool, we can go back to our students, check on another student, that's another one. That's yet another one. Fantastic. So we have this like show thing happening. What about like a cohort real quick? Like what about the other side of that? Cohorts. I want to make this more of like an application real quick. So if I go to this YOLO cohort, right now it just says the name of the cohort. But let's go back to the cohort show and let's play a sec. So yeah, cohort show. Just says the cohort name. We have an edit link. What if I say these are my students? Paragraph tag. These are our students. We'll close our paragraph tag, and then I want to iterate through this cohort students to display them. So I'll say at cohort dot students, because I have many, dot each, do student. We could probably have put the last thing that we did inside of a list. Like having all those students come up horizontally looks a little bit janky, so I'm going to try to improve on that this time. So I'm going to start the list outside of the iteration, right? And I'm going to end the list outside of the iteration. And then inside of the iteration, I'm going to fill with li tags. And that will give me block display so that each individual student will have its own line. And then within the li tag, I'm going to link to each individual student. Link to, and then, well, we just kind of did this from the student index, didn't we? We linked to the student name. And then the shorthand for going student path student is just saying student. That's going to take you to the show page like automatically. So the YOLO cohort has two students, Lindsay and Fran Danielson. So we can click and check that out. Like now we can go and actually navigate an application. We can now hop the divide between students and cohorts because of this association stuff. I think there was one more way that we could have gone ahead and done form stuff for creating a student in Students New here. Instead of using like the form tag way, we could have also done the form for way. So if we had wanted to, I'm not even sure if this is going to work since I'm nesting HTML comment tags, but let's find out. Dare to dream. No, absolutely not. It doesn't know because this closes something. So what I could do is move this out. Actually, I don't even think we need this anymore now that I'm thinking about it. Yeah, let's do it like this. Open our comment here, bang dash dash, close comment down here. Great. And now down here we can do a form for, and we have a student, don't we, in our controller because we had a new student object. I'm going to verify that. We do have student.new, so I know this should probably work. We'll say form for at student. And now I'll do a block and I'll pass it F. I want to pass the student context into the block so that I can do some stuff with each field according to that namespace of student. So instead of saying label tag, I'm going to say f.label. I'll render this because I want to see it. We'll say f.label and call this name. And Rails will be nice to me and like capitalize it and stuff for me because I'm using the really nice form for. But if I say f.textfield, name, I know it's going to say student bracket name because we're in the context of student when we pass in a model with the form for. And then here we can do another f.label, which is for the cohort. Actually, we could call this cohort ID. I think we can do the same thing with labels that we did with the label tags and like have a different argument that we can display. Maybe I want to put a colon on this to make it look like, we'll test it with both of these. I think that's how it's going to work. And then we need to do this thing with the collection, right? So before the submit tag comes in, f.submit, we need to do this f.collection select, which was that first link that I had looked at before realizing it didn't have tag on it and I didn't want to go that way. So f.collection select is its own thing, right? Here in our select tag, we had our own syntax where we called on another method inside of select tag. Options from collection for select. Collection select already knows about what the select tag needs to be named, because when we do it with the form and the f dot, we already know that like we're going to do student bracket something right now. So collection select doesn't require as much verbosity, but that can sometimes make it look even harder to understand. Because when we do a collection select, let's see if I can find the sample code here. Yeah. So we basically got, if they're doing collection select without f dot, so this first argument we're going to forget about because this first argument for them is like our saying student bracket. They're saying post bracket here. We don't need that because we're already doing f dot. So our first argument is going to be what we want to name this specific field. We're going to call it cohort ID. Second argument is going to be what the collection is that we're iterating over. We've already got an instance variable, so they're trying to show that like this is where the collection comes from. Obviously, we still want to apply MVC to our code, so I'd ask everybody to just say @cohorts or @authors in this scenario instead of like breaking our rule that views can't talk to databases. Just give it a variable from the controller. And then just like with options for collection from select, what's the value that we're going to send over the wire? And then finally, what are we going to display to the user to select? I'm not going to worry about the prompt true. That's like an optional option. I'm just going to bring in kind of this stuff, and I'm going to forget about the first argument the second that I copy paste it. So I want to have an f.collection select. And because I have f dot, I don't need to say what it's about because the f dot knows what it's about. I need to say, I'm going to convert these to strings just to keep them the same. Instead of saying author ID, we're going to say cohort ID. And instead of saying author.all, I'm going to say @cohorts. And instead of saying ID here, I'm just going to make it a string, but it's still going to be ID. And it's not name with initial. For us, it's actually a little bit simpler. It's just going to be name. And I believe that this will still work and look about the same. If we refresh here, oh no, syntax error. What did I forget? Unexpected end expecting a closed parenthesis. Sure. I don't have a closed parenthesis, which it expected. There we go. Let's examine the HTML real quick. This is the form we commented out. This is the form that we've got now. We still have selects. It's still called student cohort ID. We still have our options. The values are still going to be IDs. We're still displaying names. So at this point, we can now still like add a student. Let's do, sure. I got kind of cool with my New Orleans names one time. So that's basically creating associations and then also kind of managing them, right? Remembering that when we have a given thing, we can call this thing dot associated things dot each, and that kind of works. So yeah, is it possible to create a private method to permit params that all controllers inherit? Absolutely it is. Yeah, require is indeed asking for just the params of one specific object, kind of going back to these questions that I missed. In the controller, when we say params require, we are literally just saying like, give me only this nested hash. This is the only one that we want. And yeah, when we say for a private method, you can do something like this, permit, I believe you're allowed to say splat args, which would completely violate the whole purpose of this, right? The whole idea here is that, think about Bobby Tables again, right? Where like you don't want somebody to be able to do stuff outside of the realm of what you wanted. You don't want to ask somebody for their name and have them give you their name and then a directive to delete all the students. I don't want to ask somebody for their name and login and then get their name and login and also they are an admin and also coupon code activated equals true and also number of credits on their account equals 5 million. Like, I don't want somebody to be able to add stuff to the database that a user themselves should not be able to add. So if I did want to create something in the application controller to permit params that all controllers would inherit, the only time I'd want to do that is that if all of my controllers had exactly the same number of parameters that I wanted to keep and they all had exactly the same names. In all likelihood, that's not the case. It really takes about 15 seconds once you understand how this works to set up your parameters correctly, and it's important enough and inexpensive enough for your security that the task at hand is not to figure out how to create abstractions for this stuff. This is like Rails telling you you should be slowing down and thinking about every single time you're going to take params for an object, because what's at stake is potentially taking user info that has been sent to you maliciously to break your application, and this is kind of like a look-alive zone. We should always be like just 100% stringent about the things that we want from this kind of hash. One example in like JavaScript too is that like you might have on the other side, like you have to kind of control what objects you'd send back. If you send back nested objects of like a list of users and you don't check each individual user and realize like, oh, that user also has a nested object for their credit card, I probably shouldn't have sent those back. So whether you're receiving requests or sending responses, there's this concern of like, there's data about this object that I don't actually want the user to see or interact with directly, and I need to take steps to control that. So if that's my concern of doing this, then I think hopefully that helps you see why I wouldn't want to abstract away student params and cohort params into one simple call, because my goal here isn't simplicity, it's 100% security. I'm wondering if anybody else has any questions. I know I'm a little bit over time right now, and I apologize for that, but please fire away. Alrighty, well, if that'll conclude for now, I think that everybody should dig back into these labs. I think that the association stuff with the form, the hard piece is probably going to be that collection select or that select tag, figuring out how to get your arguments in the right order and think about what's going to happen on the other side. And also making sure that you're setting things to ID, right? And not just talking about the object that you belong to, because I think about that as a human, but what the code understands is what needs to happen in the database. And so that's the language I want to speak in my controller and also in my forms. Cool. With that, I am going to conclude this talk for now. Throw the bang bangs into the chat if you'd like. And yeah, continue practicing through stuff. With repetition comes understanding. This is a mod where we have to make a perfect pot, and the solution is to make 100 of them and break the 99 that are less perfect than that last one. Keep breaking those pots. May you find your next error very soon, y'all. Cheers.